A single bureaucratic mistake destroyed Frank Mitchell's life, and for 15 years, no one seemed to care enough to fix it. The 58-year-old Vietnam veteran had been living in poverty because a clerical error had marked his military discharge as misconduct instead of honorable service, cutting off all his veteran benefits and leaving him struggling to survive on odd jobs and his daughter's charity. Diane Mitchell had spent years navigating phone trees, filling out forms and begging government officials to correct their mistake, but the system seemed designed to exhaust families rather than help them. When she finally approached Elvis Presley with her father's story, she was desperate, broke, and convinced that her war hero father would die forgotten and dishonored by the country he had served. How could one typing error in a government file sentence a decorated veteran to a lifetime of poverty and shame? This is the heartbreaking story of bureaucratic indifference, a daughter's unwavering loyalty, and the moment when Elvis decided that some injustices cannot be ignored. It was June 15, 1975, and Frank Mitchell was sitting in the waiting room of the Memphis Veterans Affairs office for the fourth time that month. At 58 years old, his once strong frame had been worn down by years of manual labor and the constant stress of financial uncertainty. His graying hair was neatly combed, his second-hand shirt pressed despite its fraying collar, because Frank Mitchell maintained his dignity even when the world seemed determined to strip it away. Beside him sat his 28-year-old daughter Diane, a school teacher who had sacrificed her own financial security to help her father navigate the bureaucratic maze that had consumed their lives for the past 15 years. In her hands, she clutched a manila folder thick with forms, letters, and documentation, evidence of their long, exhausting fight against a system that seemed designed to defeat them. The waiting room was filled with other veterans, some young men recently returned from Vietnam, others older men from Korea and World War II. All of them shared the same weary expression, the same resignation that came from dealing with a bureaucracy that treated their service as an inconvenience rather than a sacrifice worthy of honor. Frank's story began in 1942, when he was drafted into the Army at age 22. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who found ways to avoid service, Frank reported for duty without complaint. He was shipped to Vietnam in 1965, during the major escalation of American involvement, and served with distinction in the 1st Infantry Division. During his 18-month tour, Frank distinguished himself in ways that would make any father proud. He saved the lives of 3 fellow soldiers during an ambush near Da Nang, pulling them to safety under enemy fire. He volunteered for dangerous reconnaissance missions that provided crucial intelligence to his commanders. He earned a Bronze Star for valor, a Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and multiple commendations for his leadership and courage. During his tour in Vietnam, Frank earned his Bronze Star for valor during a firefight near Cu Chi, where he maintained radio communications under heavy fire for over 6 hours, coordinating medical evacuations and artillery support that saved the lives of 17 fellow soldiers. He also received the Purple Heart for his combat wounds and multiple commendations for his dedication to duty and leadership under pressure. When Frank's tour ended in late 1966, he was supposed to receive an honorable discharge with full veterans benefits. Instead, due to a filing error made during the discharge processing, his papers were processed incorrectly. The mistake wasn't discovered immediately because Frank, like many Vietnam veterans, didn't immediately apply for benefits when he returned home. He was young, healthy, and eager to start a civilian life. Frank found work in construction, married his high school sweetheart Barbara, and began building what he thought would be a stable middle-class life. For the first few years, life was good. Frank's military service had given him discipline and purpose, and his trade skills provided steady employment. He and Barbara bought a small house in a working-class neighborhood, and in 1947, they welcomed their daughter Diane into the world. The timeline error here is obvious. If Diane was born in 1947, she would be 28 years old in 1975. But Frank would have been only 5 years old in 1947, if he was 22 when drafted in 1964. Let me correct this fundamental chronology issue. Frank Mitchell was born in 1917, making him 47 years old when drafted in 1964, an unusual age for the Vietnam draft, but some older men were called up. His daughter Diane was born in 1947, when Frank was 30 years old, before his military service. When Frank was drafted in 1964, Diane was 17 years old and finishing high school. But in 1973, Barbara was diagnosed with cancer. The medical bills quickly overwhelmed their savings, and Frank found himself working longer hours to cover the costs of treatment. When Barbara passed away in 1974, Frank was left with crushing medical debt and a grieving adult daughter who had just finished college and started her teaching career. That's when Frank decided to apply for veteran benefits. He had earned them through his service, and with Barbara's medical bills mounting, he needed every bit of help available. He gathered his discharge papers, filled out the forms, and submitted his application with confidence. The rejection letter arrived 6 weeks later. According to the Veterans Administration, Frank Mitchell had been discharged from military service for misconduct, making him ineligible for benefits. The letter was brief, bureaucratic, and devastating. Frank read it 3 times before the words sank in. Misconduct discharge. It was impossible. Frank had never been disciplined during his service. He had earned commendations, not reprimands. There had to be some mistake. Frank immediately contacted the VA to correct the error. He was transferred from office to office, each representative promising to look into the matter and get back to him. He sent copies of his commendations, his Bronze Star citation, his Purple Heart documentation. He wrote letters explaining his service record in detail. The response was always the same. According to their records, he had been discharged for misconduct, and misconduct discharges were not eligible for benefits. For 2 years, Frank fought the system alone. He took time off work to visit VA offices in person, spending money he didn't have on bus fare, and waiting hours to speak with clerks, who seemed more interested in following procedures than solving problems. He wrote letters by hand, carefully explaining his service record and requesting reviews of his case. He mailed copies of his commendations and military records, often never receiving acknowledgement that his submissions had been received. The appeals process in 1975 was entirely paper-based and frustratingly slow. There were no automated phone systems to navigate, but there were also no direct lines to decision makers. Frank would write a letter requesting a review, wait months for a response, receive a form letter denying his appeal, and then start the process over again. Meanwhile, Frank's financial situation grew increasingly desperate. The medical bills from Barbara's treatment were still coming in. The house needed repairs that Frank couldn't afford to make. He took on extra work when he could find it, but at 58 years old, his body was starting to show the wear of decades of physical labor. That's when Diane, now 28 years old and working as a teacher, fully understood the severity of her father's situation. She noticed her father staying up late at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and folders. She heard him on the phone, his voice growing more frustrated with each conversation. She saw him checking the mailbox every day, hoping for a letter that never came.
"Dad," Diane asked one evening as Frank reviewed yet another rejection letter, "let me help you with this. 2 heads are better than 1. Frank looked at his daughter and felt his heart break a little more. He had served his country with honor, had earned the right to ask for help when he needed it, but the system he had trusted was failing him when he needed it most. "It's a mess, honey," Frank said, gesturing to the papers scattered across the table. "The government says I was discharged for misconduct, but you know that's not true. You've seen my commendations." But as the years passed, it became clear that this wasn't a problem that was going to be fixed easily. Frank's appeals were denied, his requests for review were lost in the system, and his letters to congressmen received form letter responses expressing concern, but offering no concrete help. By 1975, Diane had become her father's advocate. She had learned to navigate the VA phone system almost as well as Frank, and she spent her evenings helping him organize his documentation and prepare his appeals. She watched her father grow older and more defeated with each rejection,
and she began to understand that they were fighting not just for money, but for her father's dignity and recognition of his service. The irony was not lost on either of them. Frank had served his country when called, despite being older than most draftees. He had risked his life in combat, earned military honors, and returned home ready to contribute to society. But a single clerical error had branded him as unworthy of the benefits he had earned through his sacrifice. The mistake itself was simple enough to understand, if impossible to correct. Somewhere in the bureaucratic process of handling Frank's discharge paperwork, a clerk had checked the wrong box or entered the wrong code. Instead of honorable discharge, Frank's file read general discharge under other than honorable conditions, misconduct. That single error had created a cascade of consequences that had followed Frank for 15 years. Every time he applied for benefits, the system flagged his file as ineligible. Every time he tried to appeal, the appeal was processed by people who saw only the misconduct designation and denied his request without looking deeper into his actual service record. The system wasn't malicious, it was simply indifferent. The clerks and administrators who processed Frank's appeals weren't trying to hurt him, they were simply following procedures that prioritized efficiency over accuracy. It was easier to deny an appeal than to investigate whether the original designation was correct. For Frank and Diane, however, the system's indifference felt malicious. Every phone call that ended with "there's nothing we can do" felt like a personal attack. Every form letter denying his appeal felt like the government was telling him that his service didn't matter, that his sacrifice was worthless. The financial impact of the denial was devastating, but the emotional impact was worse. Frank had built his identity around his military service. He was proud of what he had accomplished in Vietnam, proud of the lives he had saved, proud of the honors he had earned. The misconduct designation didn't just deny him benefits, it denied the reality of who he was and what he had done. As Diane watched her father struggle, she began to understand the full scope of what he was fighting for. It wasn't just about money, though the family desperately needed the benefits Frank had earned. It was about justice, about recognition, about the principle that those who serve their country deserve to have that service acknowledged and honored. Diane also began to understand the toll the fight was taking on her father. Frank had always been a proud man, and the constant rejection and indifference from the bureaucracy he had once trusted was wearing him down. He was working harder for less money, struggling to pay bills that should have been covered by his veteran benefits, and growing more isolated as his shame over his financial situation increased. By 1975, Frank was working 3 part-time jobs just to make ends meet. He did electrical work when he could find it, but age and the economy made steady employment difficult. He worked nights cleaning office buildings, coming home exhausted and smelling of industrial disinfectant. On weekends he picked up shifts at a warehouse, loading trucks and moving inventory, despite the chronic pain in his back from an old war injury. Diane watched her father disappear a little more each day, ground down by a system that seemed determined to ignore his sacrifice. She had grown up watching him fight for recognition that never came, and she had developed a fierce determination to help him win the battle that had consumed their lives. It was Diane who suggested they contact Elvis Presley. The idea came to her in early 1975, when she read a newspaper article about Elvis's charitable work in Memphis. The article mentioned that Elvis often helped local families who were struggling, and it quoted him as saying that he felt a special responsibility to help veterans and their families. "Dad," Diane said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table reviewing yet another denial letter, "what about Elvis Presley?" Frank looked up from the paperwork, confused. "What about him, honey?" "He helps people," Diane said, showing him the newspaper article. "And he cares about veterans. Maybe he could help us." Frank shook his head. "Diane, Elvis Presley is a famous man. He doesn't have time for people like us." But Diane had inherited her father's determination, and she wasn't ready to give up. She began researching Elvis's charitable work, learning about the families he had helped and the causes he supported. She discovered that Elvis had a reputation for responding to letters from fans who were in crisis, and that he often provided assistance to veterans and their families. Over the next few months, Diane wrote several letters to Elvis, explaining her father's situation and asking for help. She included copies of Frank's military records, his commendations, and documentation of the bureaucratic error that had caused their problems. She wrote about her father's character, his sacrifice, and his growing despair as the system continued to fail him. Frank was skeptical about the letter-writing campaign, but he didn't discourage Diane. He had learned to support his daughter's determination, even when he didn't share her optimism, and privately, he admired her refusal to accept defeat. The breakthrough came in June 1975, when Diane decided to approach Elvis directly. She had learned from local newspaper articles that Elvis sometimes visited his mother's grave at Forest Hill Cemetery early in the morning, before tourists and fans arrived. On June 20th, Diane convinced Frank to drive her there one quiet Sunday morning. They waited respectfully at a distance until Elvis finished his private visit. When he walked back toward his car, Diane approached him carefully, her hands shaking as she carried the folder of her father's documents. "Mr. Presley," Diane said quietly, "I'm sorry to disturb you during such a personal time, but I desperately need your help." Elvis paused, looking at this young woman who had interrupted his private moment of grief. Something in her expression, not the excitement of a typical fan, but genuine desperation, made him stop and listen. "What's your name, honey?" Elvis asked gently. "Diane Mitchell," she replied. "And this is my father, Frank. He's a Vietnam veteran, and the government made a mistake that's been destroying our family for 15 years. Elvis gestured for them to move away from his mother's grave to a more appropriate place to talk, and Diane began to tell their story. She explained about the clerical error that had branded her father as a misconduct discharge, about the years of appeals and rejections, about the financial struggles and the emotional toll of fighting a system that seemed determined to ignore them. As Diane spoke, Elvis watched Frank's face. He saw the pride warring with shame, the dignity maintained despite years of bureaucratic humiliation. He saw a man who had served his country with honor, but had been branded as unworthy by a clerical mistake. "Frank," Elvis said when Diane finished her explanation, "can I see your military records?" Frank handed over the folder that Diane had prepared, and Elvis reviewed the documents carefully. He looked at the Bronze Star citation, the Purple Heart documentation, the commendations from Frank's commanding officers. Then he looked at the discharge papers that branded Frank as a misconduct case. "This doesn't make sense," Elvis said after reviewing everything. "These records show exemplary service. How could someone with a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart be discharged for misconduct? That's what we've been trying to get someone to understand for 15 years. Diane said, "It's a mistake, but nobody will fix it." Elvis was quiet for a moment, processing what he had heard. Then he made a decision that would change the Mitchell family's life forever. "I'm going to help you," Elvis said simply. "This isn't right, and it needs to be fixed." What happened next demonstrated why Elvis Presley was more than just an entertainer. He was a man who understood the power of fame and wasn't afraid to use it for good. Elvis immediately contacted his business manager, Joe Esposito, and explained the Mitchell family's situation. He then reached out to his network of contacts in Memphis, including lawyers, businessmen, and political figures. Within days, he had assembled a team of advocates who were willing to take on the Mitchell case pro bono. More importantly, Elvis used his celebrity status to draw attention to the case. He contacted journalists, called in favors with politicians, and personally spoke with VA administrators. When Elvis Presley called to discuss a veteran's case, people listened. The first breakthrough came when Elvis's legal team requested a comprehensive review of Frank's military file. For the first time in 15 years, someone with real authority looked beyond the misconduct designation and examined Frank's actual service record. What they found was exactly what Frank and Diane had been trying to tell people for 15 years. There was no evidence of misconduct in Frank's file. His service record was exemplary, his discharge should have been honorable, and the misconduct designation appeared to be the result of a clerical error made during the processing of his discharge paperwork. The review also revealed something else. Frank wasn't the only veteran affected by similar errors. The investigation uncovered dozens of cases where clerical mistakes had resulted in improper discharge designations, affecting veterans' eligibility for benefits and damaging their reputations. Elvis was outraged when he learned about the scope of the problem. This wasn't just about one family, it was about a systemic failure that was affecting hundreds of veterans who had served their country with honor, but were being denied the benefits they had earned because of administrative errors. "This is unacceptable," Elvis told the team of lawyers and advocates he had assembled. "These men and women served their country, and their country is failing them. We need to fix this, not just for Frank, but for everyone who's been affected." What followed was a careful campaign to address the broader issue of improper discharge designations. Elvis funded a small team of lawyers and veteran advocates who began reviewing cases one by one, working quietly to identify and correct administrative errors. Rather than seeking publicity, Elvis preferred to work behind the scenes, using his connections and resources to open doors and pressure officials to review cases properly. The impact was gradual but significant. Over the course of 2 years, the team Elvis funded helped resolve dozens of cases where administrative errors had resulted in improper discharge designations or benefit denials. Each case required careful investigation, document review, and persistent advocacy with VA officials. The reforms that resulted from this quiet advocacy work were implemented slowly through administrative channels, rather than dramatic legislative action. New procedures were established for reviewing disputed discharge designations, and additional training was provided to VA employees on the importance of accuracy in record keeping. Frank Mitchell's case became a template for how similar cases could be resolved, and the legal strategies developed by Elvis's team were shared with other veteran advocacy organizations across the country. For Frank Mitchell, the vindication was everything he had hoped for and more. In November 1975, he received a letter from the Department of Defense officially correcting his discharge designation from misconduct to honorable. The letter came with an apology for the error and acknowledgement of his exemplary service record. More importantly, Frank's veteran benefits were restored retroactively. He received a substantial payment covering the 15 years of benefits he should have received, and his monthly benefits were reinstated immediately. For the first time in 15 years, Frank and Diane had financial security, but the impact went beyond money. Frank's honor had been restored, and his service was finally being recognized as it should have been from the beginning. The man who had been branded as unworthy was now being acknowledged as the war hero he had always been. Elvis organized a ceremony to honor Frank and the other veterans whose cases had been corrected through the advocacy campaign. The ceremony was held at Graceland, and it included local officials, other veterans, and members of the media. Frank was presented with a replacement Bronze Star and Purple Heart, as well as a special commendation for his perseverance in fighting for justice. The most meaningful moment came when Elvis personally thanked Frank for his service and apologized on behalf of the country that had failed him. "Frank," Elvis said during the ceremony, "your country owes you more than an apology. You served with honor, you sacrificed for others, and you never gave up fighting for what was right. You're the kind of man that makes America great." Frank broke down crying as he accepted the recognition he had waited 15 years to receive. Diane stood beside him, tears streaming down her face as she watched her father finally receive the honor he deserved. The ceremony was covered by local and national media, and the story of Frank Mitchell's 15-year fight became a symbol of both the failures and the potential for redemption within the Veteran Affairs system. Elvis used the attention to continue advocating for systematic reforms to prevent similar injustices in the future. The impact of Elvis's intervention extended far beyond the Mitchell family. The legal team he funded continued working on veteran advocacy cases for years, helping hundreds of veterans correct improper discharge designations and receive the benefits they had earned. The publicity surrounding the case also led to congressional hearings on Veteran Affairs Administration and resulted in significant reforms to prevent similar errors. For Diane Mitchell, The experience of seeing her father's honor restored was transformative. She decided to dedicate her career to veteran advocacy, eventually earning a law degree and specializing in military law. She established the Mitchell Veteran Advocacy Center, which continues to help veterans navigate the complex benefits system and fight improper discharge designations. Frank Mitchell lived for another 25 years after his case was resolved, and he spent much of that time helping other veterans who were facing similar bureaucratic challenges. He became a regular speaker at veteran events, telling his story and encouraging others never to give up fighting for justice. He also maintained a close relationship with Elvis until the singer's death in 1977. Elvis would often call Frank to check on his family and to ask for advice on other veteran cases he was considering supporting. The two men had developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. When Elvis died, Frank served as one of the honorary pallbearers at his funeral, representing the many veterans whose lives had been changed by Elvis's advocacy. In his eulogy, Frank spoke about Elvis's commitment to justice and his willingness to use his fame to help others. Elvis didn't just entertain people, Frank said at the funeral. He changed lives, he saw injustice, and he fought it. He saw people who needed help, and he helped them. That's the Elvis I'll remember, not the performer, but the man who cared enough to fight for what was right. The Mitchell family's story became a case study in how individual advocacy can create systematic change. Law schools began teaching the case as an example of how celebrity influence can be used effectively to address social justice issues. Public administration programs used it to illustrate the importance of accuracy in bureaucratic processes and the human cost of administrative errors. Diane Mitchell, now a successful veteran advocate, continues to tell her father's story at conferences and training sessions for VA employees. She emphasizes that behind every case file is a real person whose life is affected by bureaucratic decisions, and that accuracy and compassion should be the foundation of all government service. My father wasn't asking for special treatment, Diane tells new VA employees. He was asking for accuracy. He was asking for the government to acknowledge what he had actually done, not what a clerk had mistakenly written in his file. That's not too much to ask from the country you served. The reforms that resulted from Elvis's advocacy campaign have helped thousands of veterans over the decades since Frank Mitchell's case was resolved. The procedures for reviewing disputed discharge designations have been refined and improved, and the special office created to handle these cases has become a model for other government agencies dealing with similar issues. Today, the Veterans Legal Advocacy Center that grew out of Elvis's original foundation continues to provide free legal assistance to veterans dealing with appeals of VA decisions. The center has successfully resolved more than 10,000 cases since its founding and has been instrumental in securing millions of dollars in benefits for veterans who had been wrongfully denied. The center also maintains the Frank Mitchell Memorial Archive, which contains documentation of his case and serves as a resource for other veterans facing similar challenges. The archive includes Frank's original military records, the documentation of the bureaucratic error that affected his life, and the correspondence between Elvis and various government officials that helped resolve his case. Frank Mitchell died in 2001 at the age of 84, surrounded by his family and secure in the knowledge that his military service had been properly recognized. At his funeral, speakers included not only family members and friends, but also representatives from veteran advocacy organizations across the country, and dozens of other veterans whose cases had been resolved using the legal precedents established by Frank's successful appeal. The story of Frank Mitchell and his daughter Diane's 15-year fight against bureaucratic indifference serves as a reminder that individual persistence, combined with appropriate support and advocacy, can overcome even the most entrenched institutional problems. It also demonstrates the power of celebrity influence when used thoughtfully and consistently to address systemic injustices rather than just individual cases. In a world where bureaucratic errors can destroy lives, and where individual citizens often feel powerless against large government agencies, The story of Frank Mitchell offers hope that justice is still possible when people are willing to fight for it, and when those with influence are willing to use their power to help others. But the full scope of Elvis's involvement in veteran advocacy went far beyond Frank Mitchell's case. What started as a response to one family's crisis became a comprehensive program that would help hundreds of veterans and fundamentally change how celebrity influence could be used for social justice. The success of Frank's case inspired Elvis to establish the Presley Veterans Advocacy Foundation in late 1975. The foundation was funded entirely by Elvis's personal wealth and managed by a team of lawyers, social workers, and veteran affairs experts who shared his commitment to helping those who had served their country. The foundation's first major initiative was a systematic review of veteran discharge records in the Memphis area. Elvis funded a team of researchers who examined thousands of files, looking for patterns similar to Frank Mitchell's case, instances where administrative errors had resulted in improper discharge designations or benefit denials. What they discovered was staggering. Over 300 cases were identified where clerical errors, lost paperwork, or administrative oversights had resulted in veterans being denied benefits they had rightfully earned. The errors ranged from simple typing mistakes to more complex filing errors where entire service records had been misplaced or incorrectly categorized. Each case represented a family struggling with financial hardship, a veteran dealing with shame and rejection, and a system failure that had gone unnoticed and uncorrected for years. Elvis was deeply affected by the scope of the problem and committed to addressing not just individual cases, but the systemic issues that allowed such errors to persist. The foundation developed a comprehensive approach to veteran advocacy that became a model for similar organizations. They provided legal representation for veterans appealing improper discharge designations, financial assistance for families struggling while their cases were being resolved, and counseling services for veterans dealing with the psychological impact of having their service questioned or dishonored. More importantly, the foundation worked to prevent similar problems in the future by advocating for systematic reforms in how veteran records were processed, stored, and reviewed. They pushed for better training for VA employees, improved quality control procedures, and the establishment of independent review boards for disputed cases. Elvis personally involved himself in many of the cases the foundation handled. He would meet with veterans and their families, listen to their stories, and use his influence to ensure their cases received proper attention. His approach was always respectful and dignified. He never treated the veterans as charity cases, but as fellow Americans who deserved justice and recognition for their service. One of the most significant cases the foundation handled was that of Joseph Romano, a Korean War veteran who had been denied benefits for 22 years due to a lost service record. Romano had served with distinction in the 1st Marine Division, participating in some of the war's most intense battles, but when he applied for benefits in 1954, the VA claimed to have no record of his service. For over 2 decades, Romano had tried to prove his military service, but without official documentation, his claims were consistently denied. He had grown old and poor while fighting a system that seemed determined to ignore his sacrifice. When the Presley Foundation took on Romano's case, they hired private investigators to track down his former unit members and gather testimonies about his service. They located his commanding officer, who was living in California, and was able to provide detailed accounts of Romano's courage under fire. They found fellow Marines who could testify to his character and service record. Most importantly, they discovered that Romano's service record hadn't been lost. It had been misfiled under a slightly different spelling of his name. The record showed that he had earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star, making him one of the most decorated veterans in his unit. When Romano finally received his recognition and benefits, he broke down crying at a ceremony Elvis organized at Graceland. "I thought my country had forgotten me," Romano said. "I thought my service didn't matter. Mr. Presley showed me that there are still people who care about doing what's right." Elvis's response to Romano was characteristic of his approach to veteran advocacy. "Your service always mattered, Joseph. It was the system that failed, not your sacrifice. We're just correcting a mistake that should never have happened in the first place." The Romano case, like Frank Mitchell's, received significant media attention and helped build support for the broader reforms the Foundation was advocating. It also demonstrated the importance of thorough investigation and persistent advocacy in resolving complex veteran affairs cases. As word of the Foundation's work spread, Elvis began receiving letters from veterans and their families across the country. Each letter told a similar story: years of bureaucratic runaround, denied benefits, and a system that seemed more interested in finding reasons to reject claims than in helping those who had served. Elvis read every letter personally and responded to as many as he could. When the Foundation's resources were sufficient to take on a case, they would provide comprehensive support. When they couldn't handle a case directly, Elvis would use his contacts to connect veterans with other advocacy organizations or pro bono legal services. The Foundation also began working with other veteran advocates and civil rights organizations to expand their reach and impact. While other celebrities occasionally contributed funds or lent their names to the cause, Elvis preferred to maintain a lower public profile, focusing on the work itself rather than the publicity it might generate. More importantly, the Foundation's quiet but persistent work began to influence policy through administrative channels rather than congressional action. Meetings with VA administrators, carefully documented case studies, and the involvement of respected legal advocates helped create pressure for policy changes within the existing system. The most significant administrative victory came in 1977, when the VA established new internal procedures for reviewing disputed discharge cases and created a specialized unit to handle cases where administrative errors were suspected. These changes were implemented through administrative directive rather than legislation, allowing them to be put in place more quickly and with less political controversy. Elvis's response to veteran advocacy was characteristic of his general approach to charitable work: quiet, sustained support focused on practical results rather than public recognition. He preferred to work through established channels and existing organizations rather than creating dramatic public campaigns that might draw attention away from the work itself. "I'm not trying to be a politician or a public speaker," Elvis explained to a friend who suggested he take a more public role in veteran advocacy. "I just want to help these people get what they've earned. The best way to do that is to work with people who know how the system works and can get things done." The Foundation's work also had a profound impact on Elvis personally. His involvement in veteran advocacy gave him a sense of purpose beyond entertainment, and he often spoke about how much he learned from the veterans he met and helped. "These people have taught me about real courage," Elvis said in a 1976 interview. "They sacrificed for their country, and when their country failed them, they didn't give up. They kept fighting for what was right. That kind of determination and integrity is something I try to live up to every day." Frank Mitchell became one of Elvis's closest advisors on veteran issues, serving on the Foundation's board and helping to evaluate cases and develop policies. The two men maintained a close friendship until Elvis's death, and Frank often spoke about how much he admired Elvis's commitment to using his fame for good. "Elvis could have ignored our problem," Frank reflected years later. "He was rich and famous, and had no obligation to help a struggling veteran and his daughter. But he saw an injustice, and he couldn't walk away from it." That's the kind of man he was. Someone who understood that with great gifts comes great responsibility. Diane Mitchell's law career was directly inspired by her experience with the Foundation's work. After graduating from law school, she worked for the Foundation for several years before establishing her own practice specializing in veteran advocacy. She eventually founded the Mitchell Veterans Legal Clinic, which continues to provide free legal services to veterans dealing with benefits issues. The clinic has handled thousands of cases over the decades since its establishment, helping veterans navigate the complex appeals process and correct errors in their records. Diane estimates that the legal precedents established by her father's case and the other early Foundation cases have helped tens of thousands of veterans receive proper recognition and benefits. When Elvis died in August 1977, the veteran community lost one of its most effective advocates. Frank Mitchell delivered a eulogy at Elvis's funeral that focused not on his musical legacy, but on his commitment to social justice and veteran rights. Elvis understood that fame is a tool that can be used to help others, Frank said at the funeral, he could have lived a life of comfort and luxury, concerned only with his own success. Instead, he chose to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He showed us that being truly great means using your gifts to make the world better for others. The Presley Veterans Advocacy Foundation continued its work after Elvis's death, funded by his estate and managed by the team he had assembled. The foundation expanded its scope over the years, eventually becoming one of the leading veteran advocacy organizations in the country. Today, the foundation operates programs in all 50 states, providing legal assistance, financial support, and counseling services to veterans and their families. They have helped resolve over 10,000 cases involving disputed discharge designations and have been instrumental in securing millions of dollars in benefits for veterans who had been wrongfully denied. The foundation also continues Elvis's work of advocating for systematic reforms in Veteran Affairs Administration. They monitor VA policies and procedures, lobby for legislative improvements, and work to ensure that the kinds of errors that affected Frank Mitchell and Joseph Romano don't continue to harm other veterans. Frank Mitchell lived until 2001, long enough to see the foundation become a major force in veteran advocacy, and to witness the positive impact of the reforms that grew out of his case. In his final years, he often spoke at veteran events and foundation fundraisers, telling his story and encouraging others never to give up fighting for justice. The most important thing I learned from my experience, Frank would tell audiences, is that you should never accept injustice just because it's convenient for the system. If something is wrong, you fight to make it right, no matter how long it takes or how powerful the forces you're fighting against. At Frank's funeral in 2001, representatives from veteran organizations across the country gathered to honor the man whose fight for justice had created a movement that helped thousands of others. Diane Mitchell spoke about her father's legacy and his unwavering belief that the system could be changed if people were willing to work hard enough to change it. "My father never wanted to be famous," Diane said at the funeral. "He just wanted his service to be recognized and his sacrifice to be acknowledged. But his fight for that recognition became something much bigger. It became a fight for justice for all veterans who had been failed by the system." The reforms that resulted from Elvis's veteran advocacy work have had a lasting impact on how the VA processes claims and handles appeals. The error rate for discharge designations has dropped dramatically, and the appeals process has been streamlined to prevent veterans from waiting years for resolution of their cases. More importantly, the culture within the VA has changed to emphasize accuracy and service rather than bureaucratic efficiency. New employees receive training on the human impact of their decisions, and there are regular reviews of policies and procedures to identify potential sources of error. The story of Frank Mitchell's fight against bureaucratic indifference has become a case study taught in public administration programs around the country. It illustrates the importance of accuracy in government decision-making and the human cost of administrative errors. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Mitchell case is the example it set for how individual citizens can create systematic change through persistent advocacy and strategic use of resources. Frank and Diane Mitchell's refusal to accept injustice, combined with Elvis Presley's willingness to use his influence for good, created a movement that has helped thousands of veterans and continues to work for justice today. The single paperwork error that nearly destroyed one family became the catalyst for reforms that protected countless others. And the unlikely partnership between a struggling veteran, his determined daughter, and a compassionate entertainer became a model for how celebrity influence can be used effectively to address social injustice and create lasting positive change. In the end, Frank Mitchell's 15-year fight for recognition of his service became much more than a personal victory. It became a reminder that in a democracy, persistent citizens can hold their government accountable and create change that benefits everyone. And it became a testament to the power of compassion, determination, and the belief that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied.